That wool's going to get you spotted in 10 seconds. He lost him at the 11-second mark. Frank Eckhart had judged the Rocky Mountain Predator Invitational for 11 years. He wrote the competition format. 63 events on a 260-acre Montana field with 5 judges and optics on every approach. He had never said the 11-second sentence about anybody else. This 73-year-old who walked into that timber that morning had taken a piece of olive drab paracord from the chest pocket of his wool shirt jacket from 1974, held it at knee height for 3 seconds, and put it back. He'd been reading the drift in the lower 2 ft of air. Nobody at the staging area noticed. 30 ft away, the Vargas Field team, 224,000 YouTube subscribers, $8,000 in sponsored hunting equipment, was running final scent check protocols. Cole Vargas's voice carried across the parking area. That wool's going to get you spotted in 10 seconds. Montana Alpine in October. You either have the systems for it or you don't. This is not something you figure out on the day. He glanced at the wool shirt jacket. He did not have to say anything to the man wearing it. Russ did not respond. He walked to the creek drainage, crouched at the bank for 90 seconds, returned with creek clay on his hands, and applied it to his face and the backs of his hands in about 40 seconds. Then he stood and waited for the start signal. What happened over the next 2 hours and 9 minutes is still described inaccurately at every hunting expo in the northern Rockies. The bell at observation post 3 rang twice across the Montana meadow at 10:41. Russell Beckett, who Frank had lost at the 11-second mark and not seen again, had tapped it with the back of his right hand. If you believe that what you carry in your body is the equipment that matters, type terrain in the comments right now. And if you served as a Marine reconnaissance veteran or Army recon scout in Vietnam air operations, this channel was built for what you learned in those hills. Subscribe, we are not letting it stay unrecorded. The kitchen window of the single-story house south of Ennis faced the gravelly range, and Russ Beckett had stood at it before sunrise for 46 years without thinking of what he did there as anything in particular. The snow on the north face of the upper slopes told him the overnight temperature. The wind line in the upper timber, whether it angled with the snow line or against it, told him the direction of the prevailing draft. The elk on the lower bench, if he could see them, and at 5:15 on a Tuesday in October he could, just told him whether anything had been moving in the timber above them in the last 20 minutes. They were feeding heads down. Nothing had moved. The coffee had gone cold while he was looking. He drank it cold. His hands on the window sill did not belong to any photograph that had ever been taken of his hands. The left palm carried a callus pattern across the heel from 50 years of moving low brush, passing stems rather than breaking them, and the right hand was missing the tip of its index finger to the first joint. A 1971 incident that the medical record described in clinical language and that he had never described in any language at all. The finger still functioned for every purpose that mattered. Nora's work boots were on the mat by the back door of the mudroom, the specific pair, the one she had been wearing the last week of her practice year 5 years ago, dried pasture clay still in the lug pattern. He stepped around them on his way to the truck. He had stepped around them every morning for 5 years. Moving them and leaving them had both turned out to be the wrong answer to a question he had stopped asking. He had served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps. 2 of them in the Republic of Vietnam on reconnaissance patrols out of 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion in Quang Tri and Thu Thien provinces along the demilitarized zone and the Laotian border corridor. He retired in 1981 at the rank of Staff Sergeant. He had returned to Madison County and he had not left it for anything that was not necessity in the 43 years since. The reason he was driving to the Rocky Mountain Predator Invitational that morning was not complicated. His neighbor Walt Pressman volunteered with a veterans transition nonprofit called Bridgeback, which had organized a charity team for the competition. Walt had asked Russ 4 times across 6 weeks. Russ had said no 3 times and yes once. He had not been able to articulate when Walt asked him why he had finally said yes. Anything more specific than that, he had said no 3 times. From the mudroom hook, he took the wool shirt jacket and shook it out in the driveway. Olive drab faded toward a gray tan that he had never thought of as a color and that the Montana under canopy in October had thought of the same way for 50 years. The cuffs were intact, the right elbow was worn smooth. The whole garment carried a lanolin undertone that synthetics did not produce and had no language for. In the fold of the left collar, where wool gathered when the jacket hung, sat a thin line of red dirt that was not Montana red dirt. It had been there since 1971. He had never washed it, he had never thought of it as something that needed washing. At the competition, he parked at the far end of the lot. Before he opened the truck door, he sat for 40 seconds reading the wind in the upper canopy of the timber at the eastern field boundary. The angle of the upper draft did not match the angle of the lower draft visible in the meadow grass. Counter rotation. The morning inversion was still in play, the cold air pooling in the drainage and the warmer mid-canopy air moving on its own line. He noted the differential. He got out of the truck. Across the parking area, Colt Vargas was opening his Pelican case. The temperature on the staging area at 700 was 28 degrees, with the kind of dry mountain cold that does not feel cold so much as it feels like the air has been thinned of every available softness. The frost line on the meadow grass had not yet retreated. The gravelly range to the east stood in the kind of light that for the first hour after sunrise makes distant timber look closer than it is and close timber look more uniform than it is. Both of which mattered, neither of which was discussed at the staging area where the conversation was about scent. Frank Eckhart, head judge, called the briefing at 7:10, 260 acres, 40-acre open meadow with 3 creek drainages cutting through it, timber boundary to the north and east. 5 steel bells mounted on posts at the target objective 280 yards into the field. 5 judges with optics at observation post numbered 1 through 5 covering the field on overlapping arcs. 2-hour competition window. 3 flags from any judge ended a competitor. Colt Vargas asked 2 questions during the briefing. The first was about judge coverage angles in the southeast quadrant, specifically whether Op 3 and Op 4's sightlines overlapped at the 220-yard line or left a corridor. Frank confirmed there was a 4 degrees corridor between them. Colt nodded and he made a notation on his tablet. The second was about the thermal shift timing, when in Frank's 11-year experience the morning inversion typically broke. Frank said between 9:15 and 9:45 with a hard transition of about 3 minutes. Both questions were good, both answers were good. Nothing in either exchange was directed at the veterans group across the staging area. Both were the questions of a man who had prepared seriously for an event he intended to win. When Frank read the team rotation list and reached Russell Beckett on the Bridgeback Veterans roster, Colt looked across the staging area, took the full assessment of Russ's wool shirt, jacket, and knit cap and the absence of any visible technical equipment, and said something quiet to his teammate Drew. Drew looked at the wool shirt jacket. He looked back at his own kit. He did not say anything. Delia, an independent competitor in her late 30s standing 6 ft from Russ, registered the exchange and looked at the ground in the specific manner of a person revising an assumption mid-revision. Russ did not return the look. He walked 30 yd to the creek drainage at the eastern field boundary and crouched at the bank. He stayed crouched for approximately 90 seconds. He was not preparing equipment. He was reading the clay along the waterline. Its moisture, its color, the specific iron tone that said the overnight temperature in the drainage bottom had been 3 to 4 degrees colder than the staging area. The inversion would hold longer here than the judge's briefing schedule assumed. He scraped a small amount of wet clay onto his fingers, turned to the staging area and applied it to his face, his neck, and the backs of both hands in approximately 40 seconds. He stood beside Walt Pressman and waited for the start signal. At 08:54, the signal sounded. Colt's team was already in position at the timber boundary, having arrived 12 minutes earlier to run final scent check protocols. Russ walked to the timber boundary. He stepped across it. 11 seconds later, Frank Eckhart at observation post 1 lost him in terrain that offered no obvious concealment. The morning thermal shift came at 09:22, 2 minutes after the early end of Frank Eckhart's predicted window. The temperature in the meadow climbed from 31 degrees to 36 degrees in 11 minutes. The cold air pulled in the drainage began rising as the slope warmed, and the 4 men of the Vargas field team adjusted their approach angle by 12 degrees southeast in response, which was exactly the correct adjustment executed by men who had practiced exactly this transition. Frank, watching from observation post 1 with his binoculars, made a notation in his judge's log that read, Subject CV team, thermal adjustment clean, pace acceptable 180 YD ETA approximately 10:10. What he was not noting, because he could not, was anything about Russell Beckett. Russ had crossed the timber boundary at 08:54. Frank had lost him at 08:54:11. From that moment until 09:38, Frank's binoculars, sweeping the eastern timber, the drainage corridor, the open meadow at full magnification, the shadow line under the canopy edge, registered no human figure that should not have been there. At 09:38, Frank caught a movement in his peripheral vision that resolved into the back of Russ's wool shirt jacket, 12 FT from the southwest pillar of observation post 3. He was moving across the OP3 judge's blind side quadrant, the same 4 degrees corridor Colt had asked about in the briefing tale, at a rate the stopwatch confirmed at 18 in per minute, maybe a fraction less. He had been somewhere in that field for 44 minutes. Frank wrote one line in the log, subject RB used OP3 blind side, movement rate approximately 18 in per minute, visual signature 0. He underlined the last 2 words. Russ had said one sentence to Walt Pressman in the staging area before the competition started. Walt had asked in the conversational way of a man trying to be friendly whether Russ thought the timber would be easier than the meadow. Russ had said, neither is easier. The timber gives you texture, the meadow gives you movement room. What you don't have in either is time. The thermal shift is at about 90 minutes in. You want to be placed before the shift, not moving through it. Walt had nodded without entirely understanding the geometry of what Russ had said and had written it in his phone notes anyway, the way a man writes down a sentence he expects to need. At 1008, Colt's team reached the 180 YD mark, exactly on schedule. Their pattern was breaking silhouette effectively against the sage. Their scent management was holding. Frank had OP4 covering the 180 to 220 YD zone, watched them through his optics and made a positive notation in his log. At 1:09, Frank flagged Colt. The cause was not scent. It was not movement, it was not pattern. The GoPro Max mounted on Colt's chest harness produced a brief lens flare reflection in the October light at the specific angle the sun had reached as the thermal lifted the haze off the meadow grass. The reflection lasted under a second. Frank caught it. The flag was for visual signature, not the kind any of the $8,000 of equipment on the Vargas Field team's bodies had been engineered to address. The reflection was in the $0 range of variables, and the $0 range had not been considered. Dahlia, the independent competitor in her late 30s, made it to the 220 YD line before being flagged for movement speed. She did not have scent lock. She had moved through the meadow in a wool field shirt and a pair of dark cargo pants and had used the drainage corridor for the first 140 YD. She had been the second best performer in the field that morning. She would, at the end of the competition, ask Frank one specific question that would lead to a 3-minute conversation, after which she would drive to the NS hardware store on Monday. At the spectator rope, Walt Pressman was being asked with increasing frequency where Russ was. He could not answer. 2 Bridgeback team members had been scanning the meadow with their own binoculars for 40 minutes and had seen nothing. Walt felt a specific pride mixed with the specific anxiety about whether Russ was all right out there in country he had been crossing since 1978. He considered calling Russ's name across the field. He decided not to. He had known the man for 6 years. He understood that the last thing Russell Beckett would want in the middle of an operation that was working as designed was to be called out of it. At 10:41, the bell at observation post 3 rang twice across the meadow. The bell at observation post 3 rang twice. 2 clean light strikes in succession, the specific sound of a steel bell on a steel post tapped by a hand rather than struck. Frank Eckhart at observation post 1 a mile and 2/10 to the southwest heard it through his radio before the physical sound carried across the meadow to him. His radio activated simultaneously with the 4 others. The voice on it was OP3 Judge Annette Bride saying, "Subject is at the bell, he just rang it." Then after a beat, "Frank, I never saw him cross the 10 FT line." Russ had crossed the timber boundary at 08:54 and disappeared into terrain that offered no obvious concealment because May in his framework no terrain offered obvious concealment. What terrain offered was problems, and the problems in this particular field had organized themselves into a path that the 5 judges' coverage maps did not contain. He'd moved through the timber at a pace the vegetation registered as wind. He'd crossed the drainage bottom in movement windows time to canopy movement above him. He'd crossed the open meadow corridor in 2 segments, each segment displaced during the 1-second intervals when Op4's scan was at the far end of its arc. He'd moved the final 40 yards from the timber edge to Op3's blind side pillar at 18 in per minute over 34 minutes using the boundary of a shadow line that moved with the sun. The final 8 FT were on his feet. He stood up from the prone to knee transition that had cost him an extra 30 seconds because the left hip did not negotiate cold October ground the way it had negotiated cold ground in 1971, and he managed the standing motion through the same pace discipline the rest of the stock had required. He stepped to the bell post, he raised his right hand, he tapped the bell twice with the back of the hand. The hand missing the tip of its index finger because the callus on the back of that hand was quieter than a knuckle, and because he'd used the back of that hand for any contact requiring sound discipline since 1971, the bell rang twice. He stood beside the post. He waited for Judge Briard to confirm on the radio. She did. He took 2 steps back from the bell and he stood, and he did not move. Frank arrived at the staging area at 10:52 in the side-by-side the judges used for coverage transitions. He walked the open log to the briefing pavilion. He stood at the front of the assembled competitors and spectators and read into the microphone in the flat voice of a man reading numbers. He was not editorializing. Subject Russell Beckett, complete stock undetected, 260 acres, 2 hours 9 minutes elapsed. Total path traveled from timber entry to bell, 5 and 4 10 miles, including approaches, holds, and 2 full reversals to avoid coverage at Op1 and Op4. Visual detection 0, scent detection 0. At 1001, the subject passed within 11 FT of observation post 2 at a movement rate of 18 in per minute. Frank lowered the page. For approximately 12 seconds, the staging area did not process. The wind flag at the edge of the field continued to move. Somebody's radio handset clicked once and then did not click again. The specific silence at the staging area was the silence of people running calculations against a result that their framework could not contain results for. Walt Pressman had a hand on Russ's arm in the specific way of a man who was not sure whether he was steadying somebody else or himself. Dahlia, the independent competitor, had her notebook out and was writing something. She stopped writing. She looked at the left collar fold of Russ's wool shirt jacket, at the line of red dirt visible there, and her expression became the beginning of an understanding she could not yet name. Drew, Colt's teammate, removed the GoPro Max from his chest mount and held it at his side without making a decision about where to put it next. Colt was 20 FT from the briefing pavilion. He had his Garmin InReach Mini 2 in his right hand, the terrain map open on its display, the judge positions and approach corridors highlighted. He was working backward from the bell at Op3 through the coverage map to find the path that had not been flagged. His thumb moved across the screen without finding what he was looking for. The screen did not contain what had found it. Frank closed the log and looked across the staging area at Russell Beckett, who was drinking from a water bottle and looking at the gravelly range. Frank said, "I've run this event 11 years. I'm going to tell you something I should have said in the briefing this morning." Nobody moved. Frank Eckhart asked Russ if he could borrow the wool shirt jacket. Russ handed it over with the specific expression of a man who did not yet know what was being done with it, but had decided not to object until it became clear whether he should. Frank held the jacket up. "Russell, this jacket has been in field use since when?" "74, that's what I thought." Frank addressed the assembled group. He described the color first, not as an aesthetic, but as a record. He described the matted wool surface that broke specular reflection the way no synthetic fabric on the field that morning did, because no synthetic fabric on the field that morning had been compressed and recompressed by 5 decades of contact with mountain vegetation. Then he held up the left collar fold and pointed at the line of red dirt visible inside it. "This dirt is from somewhere that is not Montana. It has been in this jacket since 1971. I know this because Russell Beckett told me in 1985, sitting on a rock in the gravelly range 12ft from a bedded bull elk who did not move while we approached him, that the red dirt in his collar came from Quang Tri Province. 53 years. He was a Marine Reconnaissance Team Leader, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion. He learned to move through terrain from a gunnery sergeant who had learned it in Korea from a man who had done the same thing before that. The jacket got the right color by being in the field for 50 years. The framework got its validity the same way. Russ said, Frank. Frank held up a hand without rudeness. I've spent 38 years trying to teach hunters what I watched that man do on a Saturday morning in 1985. Today is the first time I've watched anybody else do it at that level. He is 73 years old. He came to this competition because his neighbor asked him 4 times. The dirt in his collar has been there longer than 3 of you have been alive. In the parking area 20 minutes later, Colt Vargas approached Russ at his truck. He had removed the GoPro Max from his chest mount and put it in his pack before walking over. He stopped at the correct distance. He did not start speaking immediately. When he did, he said, what I said this morning about the systems for thermal management, I said it where you could hear it. I was performing preparation rather than doing it. The preparation I did was real. What I performed wasn't the same thing. He stopped. I built my channel on the idea that the right equipment closes the gap. Today I found out what closes the gap isn't what I thought. Russ looked at him for a moment. Your scent management is correct, he said. Your thermal read this morning was correct. You know one of the 5 problems very well. That's a starting point. The other 4 are not equipment problems. He opened the truck door. If you want to learn the other 4 Saturday mornings will get you started. The rest is built in the field over a long time. The Tuesday morning after the competition, Russ stood at the kitchen window before dawn with his coffee. The gravelly range was dark except for the snow on the upper slopes catching the first pre-dawn light that wasn't quite light yet. He read what he could read from this. He drank the coffee while it was still hot, which was unusual. On his way out, he stepped around Nora's boots in the mudroom and stopped briefly in the doorway before stepping through, which he did not usually do. The wool shirt jacket hung on the hook behind him, left collar fold in its natural position. The red dirt in it visible if you knew where to look. He walked into the east field at first light. The gravelly range above him caught light just beginning to be light. He moved through the lower timber at the unhurried pace of a man not going anywhere except through the terrain at the speed the terrain permitted. The wool shirt jacket was the correct color for this light and would be for the next decade if he kept using it correctly. He moved through a gap in the tree line. The gap closed behind him. Equipment is made in factories. Knowledge of this kind is made in the terrain, paid for in the attention you give it every time you get it wrong. This channel exists because there are men like Russell Beckett in houses on gravel roads in mountain valleys with wool jackets on the mudroom hook and red dirt in the collar fold from somewhere they have never explained. They are not waiting to be asked. They have continued to practice what they learned every morning in the country behind the house. Subscribe so the recording happens before the recording becomes impossible. Russ moved on through the timber at the speed the terrain permitted.